You know what really haunts me in this craft? You spend weeks building something. You pick good lumber, you cut clean joints, you finish it with care, and then 5 years later you find rot creeping into the end grain, or powder post beetles have turned your tenons into dust from the inside out. I dealt with that for years and I just accepted it as part of working with wood. Then, about 6 years ago, I got invited to watch a restoration crew working on a medieval church in southern England. The oak timbers in that roof were original, 800 years old. And when they pulled one out to replace a section that had been damaged by a lightning strike, not rot, the wood inside was still sound. Dense, dark, and perfectly intact after 8 centuries. I asked the head carpenter how that was possible, and what he told me completely changed how I think about wood. Today I am going to walk you through exactly what those medieval guild carpenters did to make their timber virtually immune to rot and insects, a process called water seasoning. And stick around to the end because I will show you a way to use a version of this technique in your own shop, even if you do not have a river in your backyard. Let me show you what I found. What we are really talking about today is a lost preparation method, one that medieval carpenters across England and France relied on for centuries. It was not a finish. It was not a preservative. It was a way of fundamentally changing the wood itself before they ever picked up a tool. And once you understand the thinking behind it, you start to see how much we have given up in the name of speed. So let me give you some background on who these craftsmen were and why their approach deserves serious attention. From roughly the 12th century through the 15th century, timber framing in England and France was controlled by carpenter guilds. These were not casual operations. You apprenticed for 7 years before you were allowed to call yourself a journeyman. The master carpenters who ran cathedral and castle projects had decades of experience, and they passed their methods down through direct instruction. Almost nothing was written down. That is why so much of this knowledge disappeared when the guild system collapsed. What survived is the wood itself. When researchers and restoration carpenters examine medieval oak timbers today, they consistently find something remarkable. The wood is extraordinarily stable. It resists rot and insect attack far better than modern kiln-dried oak, even modern air-dried oak. For a long time, people assumed it was just because they used old-growth timber with tighter grain. And that is part of it. But the bigger factor, the one that kept coming up in every conversation I had with people who actually work on these structures, is water seasoning. The principle is deceptively simple. Before they used a log, they submerged it in running water, typically a river or mill stream, and left it there for anywhere from 2 to 7 years, sometimes longer. The running water slowly leached out the sap, sugars, starches, and soluble tannins, all the organic compounds that fungi and insects feed on. What remained was essentially the cellulose and lignin skeleton of the wood, the structural parts that nothing wants to eat. The result was a timber that could last for centuries in conditions that would destroy conventionally seasoned wood in a few decades. Now let me walk you through how they actually did this, step by step, because the details matter more than you might think. The first thing these guild carpenters understood is that water seasoning does not work equally well on every species or every log. They were almost exclusively working with English oak, Quercus robur, and in France, Quercus petrea. Both are ring-porous hardwoods with high tannin content and excellent natural durability. But even within oak, they were selective. They wanted straight-grained logs from mature trees, typically 80 to 120 years old, with a trunk diameter of at least 18 inches. Younger trees had too much sapwood relative to heartwood, and sapwood does not water season well because its cell structure is more open, and it breaks down faster in submersion. Equally important was when they felled the tree. This was not done casually. Medieval carpenters felled their oak in winter, typically between November and February. The reason is practical, not mystical. In winter, the sap has receded. The moisture content of the wood is at its lowest natural point, and the concentration of sugars and starches in the cells is reduced. That means less material for the water to leach out, which shortens the seasoning time and produces a cleaner result. If you felled a tree in June when it was full of sap, the submersion process took longer, and the wood was more likely to develop bacterial staining. This is something I have confirmed with modern timber framers, who still occasionally practice water seasoning in Scandinavia. Winter-felled oak comes out of the water cleaner and more uniform in color. The second part of the process, and this is something I did not expect, is how carefully they prepared the logs before putting them in the water. They did not just roll a whole trunk into the river. The logs were typically hewn to a rough dimension first, squared off with a broad axe so that more surface area was exposed to the running water. A round log with its bark still on would season unevenly because the bark acts as a barrier. The cambium layer, that thin zone just under the bark, traps moisture and sugars and can actually start to ferment in stagnant water. So they would strip the bark, hew the log roughly square, and in many cases split larger logs in half or into quarters using wedges and a beetle, which is basically a large wooden mallet. The goal was to maximize the ratio of exposed wood surface to volume. A quartered log might be 8 inches by 10 inches by 12 feet. That size allowed the water to penetrate deeply enough to leach the interior, not just wash the outside. They also paid attention to where in the river the logs were placed. They wanted moving water, not still ponds. The current carried away the dissolved sugars and tannins so they would not redeposit into the wood. Stagnant water can actually cause anaerobic bacterial growth that produces a condition called bacterial wetwood, which makes the timber spongy and foul-smelling. The guild carpenters avoided this by securing their logs in the main flow of the stream, often weighting them down with stones or staking them to the riverbed, so they stayed fully submerged but exposed to current on all sides. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now here is where patience becomes the defining feature of this whole approach. Once the logs were in the river, they stayed there. The typical submersion period for a squared oak timber of 8 to 10 inches in cross-section was 3 to 5 years. Larger timbers, the kind used for cathedral ridge beams and principal rafters, might stay submerged for 7 years or more. There are historical references from French cathedral archives suggesting some timbers were submerged for a full decade before use. What is happening during that time is a slow, steady extraction process. The running water enters the wood cells through the end grain and through the exposed face grain. It dissolves the free sugars, the starches stored in the ray cells, and a significant portion of the water-soluble tannins. These are exactly the compounds that attract fungal spores and wood-boring insects. Oak has natural durability because of its tylocies, those bubble-like growths that plug the vessels in heartwood, and because of its tannin content. But tannins are a double-edged sword. While they offer some antifungal properties, the soluble fraction of the tannins also serves as a food source for certain brown rot fungi. Water seasoning removes that soluble fraction while leaving the bound tannins intact in the cell walls. The result is wood that keeps its natural chemical defenses, but loses the compounds that attract biological attack. Modern wood scientists have confirmed this. Studies on submerged archaeological oak, including timbers pulled from medieval bridge pilings and riverport structures, show significantly reduced sugar and starch content compared to freshly felled oak. They also show increased dimensional stability because the slow leaching process allows the wood cells to relax gradually rather than being forced into shape by kiln heat. I want to be clear about something. This wood was not petrified or mineralized like some ancient wood you see. It was still oak. It still worked like oak. But it was calmer, if that makes sense. Less reactive to humidity changes, less prone to checking and splitting as it dried. Once the timber came out of the river, the process was not finished. This is the part that a lot of people overlook when they read about water seasoning. You cannot take a waterlogged timber and immediately use it. The wood is saturated, it needs to air dry, and the way they handled that drying phase was just as deliberate as the submersion. The logs were pulled from the river and stacked on timber bearers, raised off the ground by at least 12 to 18 inches to allow air circulation underneath. They used stickers between each layer, just like we do today when air drying lumber, but their stickers were thick, often 2 inches square to allow maximum airflow. The stacks were placed under open-sided shelters, covered on top to keep off rain but open to the breeze on all sides. They did not want the wood to dry fast. Fast drying causes surface checking because the outside shrinks before the inside can catch up. The air drying period after submersion was typically 1 to 3 years, depending on the thickness of the timber and the local climate. A general rule that I have heard from modern traditional timber framers is 1 year of air drying per inch of thickness, but that can vary significantly depending on humidity and wind exposure. The key indicator was weight. They would periodically lift or shift the timbers and judge by feel whether the wood had reached a workable moisture content, probably somewhere around 15 to 20% for structural use. What is fascinating is that water-seasoned oak, once air dried, tends to be more dimensionally stable than conventionally air-dried oak. The theory is that the slow leaching process allows the cell structure to reach a kind of equilibrium that rapid drying disrupts. I have handled water-seasoned oak from a restoration supply yard in Kent, and the difference is noticeable. The wood feels dense but not heavy. It planes beautifully. The surface has a warmth to it that kiln-dried oak just does not have. Now, once the timber was dry enough to work, the carpenters found that water-seasoned oak behaved differently under their tools, and this is the part that really got my attention as a hand tool woodworker. The wood was harder and denser than green oak, but it was not brittle the way some extremely old or over-dried oak can be. The cell structure had settled into a very uniform state, so the tool resistance was consistent. No soft spots where sap pockets had been, no gummy residue on the blade. The shavings came off clean and curled nicely. The carpenters used axes, adzes, and draw knives for the rough shaping, then finished their joinery with chisels and handsaws that were not dramatically different from what we use today. The tools were simpler, certainly. No precision ground blades. But the wood was so cooperative that the joints came together cleanly. And here is the real payoff. Because the wood had already given up its sugars and starches, and because it had been slowly brought to equilibrium, it barely moved once it was in place. Those cathedral timbers are still tight after 800 years because the wood was essentially finished moving before it was ever cut to size. Let me share some patterns I have noticed in my own work, things I used to do that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for kiln-dried lumber by default. Most of us buy kiln-dried because it is available, it is predictable, and it is ready to use today. But kiln drying drives moisture out fast using heat, and that speed comes at a cost. The wood develops internal stress, it case hardens, and those stresses show up later as warping, cupping, or joints that open up. The second pattern is treating wood like a dead material. We machine it square, glue it together, and expect it to stay put. Medieval carpenters treated every piece of timber as something that was still alive in a sense, still adjusting, still responding to its environment. They prepared it so thoroughly before working it that they could trust it once it was in place. The third pattern is relying on finishes and chemical treatments to protect against rotten insects. We spray on insecticide, we brush on sealers, we pressure treat with copper compounds. All of that works to some degree, but it is an outside-in approach. Water seasoning works from the inside out. It removes what the organisms want rather than putting something on the surface to repel them. The fourth pattern is impatience, and I am as guilty of this as anyone. We want to start building. We want the project done. Medieval carpenters planned years ahead. They felled trees knowing that someone might not use that timber for 5 or 10 years. That kind of patience is almost unimaginable in a modern hobby shop, but even a small step toward it pays off. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. You obviously cannot submerge a full log in a river for 5 years, but here is something you can do. If you work with green wood, especially for turning or for chair legs and spindles, try soaking your blanks in a tank of fresh water for 4 to 6 weeks before you start working them. Use a large plastic tub or a stock tank. Change the water every few days so it does not go stagnant. What you are doing is a small-scale version of the same leaching process. The water pulls out the free sugars and some of the starches. When you pull the blank out and let it dry slowly, you will notice less cracking, less dramatic movement, and the finished piece will be more stable long-term. I started doing this about 3 years ago with green white oak spindle blanks, and the difference in how they behave during drying is remarkable. Instead of developing the deep radial cracks I used to get, they dry down gently with almost no checking. It is not a 5-year river submersion, but it captures a meaningful fraction of the benefit with minimal effort. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Lost Workshop. 17 chapters of medieval hand tool techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with 33 illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe.